You and I, bear with us while we muddle through these technical challenges, um, otherwise known as my incompetence. I wrote a song. It's about dystopia. Listen, let me practice. In 1984, Orwell said you should deplore a dystopia. In 1984, Orwell said you should deplore a dystopia. More later, perhaps. But who was Orwell? Who was George Orwell? We're going to learn about him today. We'll revise what we did yesterday, and I'm going to give you some work that we'd like you to send to your English teachers. It's just a paragraph, more if you like. What does meagre mean? Do you remember from last year? Meagre. Dickens presented the Cratchit family as meagre in A Christmas Carol when they used to think about some aspect of the Cratchit family and how they were meagre. Meagre means small, undernourished, thin, a small amount. And last time I spoke to you, I think you studied totalitarian government. So what is a totalitarian government? Remember, totus plus that other Latin word. And an example of a totalitarian government is the government of where. So think of all the states in the world and give me an example of one that's bossy and autocratic and a government where it's a government by command and control rather than discussion. And give me an example of what they do. So the government of where, which does what. And new words, scrutinize. Is that spelled right? Yeah. Scrutinize means to examine or inspect closely and thoroughly. Let's pause the video if you need more time for any of this stuff. And surveillance. I thought sorry for loading two words onto the front page, but surveillance is an important word that comes up later. It's an important concept. It means, no, it doesn't mean to examine closely and thoroughly at all, does it? It's completely wrong. I'm going to change that now, if you don't mind. Let's go out and back in. It means observation. Is that recording? No. Yes. As I say, my incompetence. Today you're going to know about George Orwell and his inspirations. He's the author of 1984, and we're going to write about why or how it's dystopian. Some revision. Do you remember the video I made about the dystopian themes are about 7: government control, religious control, what else is there? Loss of individualism and so on. You did some writing, I think, or made some notes. And there was a TED talk here about how to recognize dystopian themes, isolation, loss of freedom, and the exaggeration of contemporary threats. He explained the difference between utopia, which means some place, is it, and dystopia, meaning bad place. And there's a tree, the natural world's turning into a holocaust. We looked at human rights, and you wrote about how they are demonstrated to be breached in dystopian stories. You looked at a section of 1984 written by the great George Orwell. Such an important writer, not just because of his philosophy, his ethos, but also his writing technique. He's a very skillful essayist and writer, and you can learn a lot from the way he produces text. So O'Brien picked up the cage and, as he did so, pressed something in it. This, you remember, is a torture scene where a box of rats is attached to Winston's face as a means of interrogating him. Um, so yeah, O'Brien moved the cage nearer. It was less than a meter from Winston's face. Orwell himself wasn't too comfortable with the idea of rats being around. This is an extract from his time in Spain, where he was fighting as a communist or a socialist for the Spanish government or a Spanish militia. In the barn where we waited, the floor was a thin layer of chaff over deep beds of bones, human bones and cows' bones mixed up. Cow's bones mixed up, and the place was alive with rats. The filthy brutes came swarming out. In fact, Orwell calls the rats in 1984 brutes. You look at that extract in more detail in a few days. If there's one thing I hate, it is a rat running over me in the darkness. So how did this private school educated gentleman end up on the front line fighting with a lot of other unwashed young men surrounded by rats and wearing cheap boots that fell apart as they were marching? He went to Eton. He was christened Eric Arthur Blair, very English name for a very English man, went to a very English school. He was actually very poor, though. He won a scholarship, clever as he was, to go to this extremely expensive boarding school. And he felt like an outsider there because he didn't have the money that the princes and the sons of captains of industry did. And this is him fighting with some fellow communists in Spain. He had an interesting career. He also worked as a policeman in Burma, Rangoon. I think it's called Malaya now or something. There's a lady at the bottom right, if you can see that in a bit more detail. You saw this picture a couple of days ago, actually, but that is Orwell's girlfriend, or possibly wife at the time. And I think it's an extraordinary effort on her part to go out to the front line. She used to send George creature comforts from England, cigars and decent socks while he was on the front line. She even took the trouble to make a visit to him there. And George Orwell importantly worked for the BBC's propaganda department during the war. That's where he received a lot of ideas for his novel 1984, the building and the methods of Big Brother's government. In fact, Room 101 was in the basement of the BBC. So I'm going to show you a video made by a very concisely spoken gent, and I'd like you to make some notes on it. What do you learn about George Orwell and why he chose to write?
There's some important context to know before getting into 1984. 1984 was published in 1949, not long after Joseph Stalin's Great Purge of the 1930s. Stalin was the leader of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and under Stalin's communism, the state seized all private property to become communal. But this didn't give the working class more power. Stalin became a dictator. His totalitarian government eliminated all opposition to his rule. Secret police watched the citizens and used torture tactics to get false confessions from his enemies. The Great Purge made millions of people disappear, sent to prison camps or executed. Their public records were destroyed. During the Spanish Civil War, Stalin funded the Socialist Republican government in its battle against the fascist nationalists. Stalin accused many of his allies on the Republican side of treason, and the resulting infighting on the Republican side created even more bloodshed. World War II was another example of the destructive power of the kind of totalitarianism 1984 represents. Adolf Hitler's Nazi party put people in concentration camps and had them killed. The expansionist Axis powers fought against the Allies, although the Allies ultimately won. History has forgotten many of the names of the victims of the Holocaust. They became, and were actually called, non-persons. Their histories erased. The late 1940s and 1950s saw attention paid to uncovering facts the Nazis tried to hide, and Orwell's story is a cautionary reminder to readers of the danger of a regime that refuses to take responsibility for its actions. Orwell was a supporter of socialism and was determined to create better living conditions for the working poor. Orwell was fervently anti-totalitarian and stayed an anti-Stalinist right up to and during the writing of 1984. He continued to believe that a form of socialism called ethical socialism offered a fairer society. The political system in the novel 1984 is called Ingsoc, short for English socialism. But Orwell named the political system that because he saw England as just as vulnerable to totalitarianism as any other country. 1984 is an anti-totalitarian novel, not an anti-socialist one. Now, 1984 made an immediate impression on its early readers and was considered a novel of political prophecy. Its rise of technology and an increasingly divided and partisan media is still relevant in the 21st century as it was when it was first published. Several words from 1984 have entered the English-speaking lexicon: Big Brother, Newspeak, Thought Police, and Doublethink among them. The adjective Orwellian has come to characterize a dystopian, totalitarian future.
Thank you, my learned friends. So let's reflect on Big Brother, the name. Have anyone seen that game show where housemates are in a house? Big Brother is this. He's an all-seeing, all-knowing entity, and it takes its name from George Orwell's character, Big Brother. You never meet Big Brother, but he's like just a shapeless entity. I was reading today about something called QAnon in America. Donald Trump says no one knows who they are, but they're men behind the scenes who are controlling, manipulating Joe Biden, allegedly. So it's another one of these faceless organizations. The Wizard of Oz, perhaps, is someone similar. Let's push on. The chap just now, that American guy, told us about how people were purged and became unpersoned. This chap is a spy called Nicholas Lyezov. He was a friend of Stalin. But look at how dystopian leaders or totalitarian leaders can manipulate the past. He disappears. He vanishes from Stalin's left hand as if he never existed. They obviously had a disagreement, and Stalin sent him to be purged. It's such a neat way of massaging the truth. The purge is actually a murder or genocide, but people are referred to as being unpersoned. So, yeah, he was called the Vanishing Commissar because after his execution, his likeness was retouched out of an official press photo. The Russians were renowned for doing that sort of thing. He also mentioned that George Orwell gave the word Orwellian to stories in which there's a lot of state control, propaganda, and linguistic double speak. So there's also surveillance, disinformation, and the past, as I mentioned with Yezov, is manipulated, and double speak, words that are designed to avoid hard truths. So we're going to do some readings soon, aren't we? Let's see. Is there anything more to say? Astonishingly, only 6% of households had more than one room in Moscow. Despite that, Joseph Stalin was known as Uncle Joe. As I mentioned, this avuncular character who looks friendly, sort of angelic, Christ-like, and that jolly face of Soviet generosity. What generosity? 6% of households, only 6% of households had more than one room. That's an astonishing figure. So 1984 articulates that poverty. Let's have a read now. We should have sent you a text, so I'm going to try and escape this program here. Where am I going? Here, I'm going to leave PowerPoint, jump into Word. Meanwhile, you're taking out your copy of 1984. I won't read the whole thing because it's about 4 pages. but just enough to give you an idea, an impression of how to write one or more of these paragraphs. I suggest if you're in one of the higher sets, you write more than one. I'll give you a model, ask you to copy that, and then write your own paragraph. And then if you want to challenge yourself, write another. So we're going to ask ourselves, how is this a dystopian story? This is chapter 1, and it's a celebrated opening statement. It was a bright cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breath in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. So the landscape isn't very pleasant. It's a cityscape. It's unkempt. It's dirty. It's unhealthy. Orwell himself suffered ill health. In fact, his wife typed his stories for him. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide, the face of a man of about 45 with a heavy black mustache. Does this ring a bell? Does this sound similar to you? Does this sound familiar to you? A heavy black mustache. A dictator with a heavy black mustache. What dictators had heavy black mustaches? There's at least one. Stalin, for one. Hitler, perhaps. And ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, which means not often working. And at present, the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. Remember, despite the Soviets' promise, only 6% of the nation had more than one room. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. Economy drive, this surely is propaganda. It's worth highlighting this, actually. Economy drive, not government mismanagement of funds. Hate Week is a weekly slanging match or weekly celebration of all that's good about this government and all that's bad about the enemy government. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times along the way. Remember, George Orwell suffered ill health. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. The poster reads, "Big Brother is watching you." The caption beneath it ran. And why does the poster say that? Well, because of the telescreen. So inside the flat, a fruity voice. What could a fruity voice be? Well, perhaps something attractive. He was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror, which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. I imagine a modern-day equivalent would be one of those speaker things where you can talk and it can sing to you or order your shopping or tell you what the weather is, you know, those Alexa or Google things. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there's no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to a window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls, which were the uniform of the party. So this echoes communist governments. In China, it used to be the case that people dressed very conservatively and similar to each other because it's sort of uniform, and it shows that everyone's supposed to be equal. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and the cold of the winter that had just ended. I think that comes from George Orwell's time in Spain. He had to suffer blunt razor blades and going unwashed. An Englishman going unwashed for more than a day is unheard of. Again, there's a reference to Big Brother. So if you're looking at how dystopian themes are presented, look at surveillance and how you're reminded that you're always watched, and helicopters snoop into people's windows. I'm going to push on a little to hear. So any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by the telescreen. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment, how often, or on what system the thought police plugged in was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. So it's the idea that you may be watched keeps you obedient, keeps your actions civil. And let's jump out now back into PowerPoint for a model. So the question is, the task is to identify the dystopian conventions. Now, here we are. So could you please copy this overview? Just pause the video and just write this down. 1984 is a dystopian text in a number of ways, including references to surveillance, propaganda, and political doublespeak. So I'd like you to look for examples of all of those. If you're bright and clever and confident, then write about all three. If you are a bit busy, just write about two. So firstly, 1984 is dystopian when it describes the prevalence of posters saying Big Brother's watching. The phrase shows successfully, I think I actually prefer ominously, how the state is reminding the population that their actions are under scrutiny. So to make the link to dystopia, you mentioned scrutiny. The government either openly or secretly surveys and scrutinizes the public's actions. And we could do more than this, though. We can also judge why Big Brother's watching. It's probably because he wants to ensure the population is obedient and fearful. We can do even better by explaining something about George Orwell's intentions, something we know about the man. So it represents his intention to highlight the violent methods of totalitarian states such as Soviet Russia. So you can see how the model goes from moderately successful to more sophisticated, trying to put our minds into the head of Big Brother, to referencing context as well. Good habits to get into, folks. But at the very least, just put some evidence, and how it shows it's dystopian. So I'll leave you to read the rest of the article and look at how those other dystopian themes are referenced in 1984. So we look forward to receiving your model plus at least one other paragraph. In 1984, Orwell said you should deplore a dystopia. In 1984, Orwell said you should deplore a dystopia. One Big Brother who always watches you. 9, you're fine if you drink gin. 8, too late to fret. Your government won't let 4 corners of his world see truth. In 1984, Orwell said you should deplore a dystopia. In 1984, Orwell said you should deplore a dystopia.